Are you, as a modern player, sick and tired of all these dang free spells in these Modern Horizon sets? Well, it seems like Wizards has a tool for you. We've got Vexing Bauble, a 1 mana artifact that says whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. And it also cycles for just 1 mana, so playing multiple copies of this card in your deck isn't going to run you the problem of them not doing nothing if you draw multiple copies. And it makes them kind of annoying for your opponents to disenchant, because if you just have a mana up, you can cycle it and get a nice 2-for-1 if your opponent tries to disenchant your Vexing Bauble. It is symmetrical, so you can't play this alongside your own stack of free spells, but I think this is going to be a super duper potent. I don't even want to call it a sideboard card in Modern, because I think there's going to be lots of situations where this is main deckable. I think that most Urza Saga decks without free spells will probably be pretty interested in main decking a copy. I could definitely see in the right metagame just wanting to jam a bunch of copies of this card. I think this is going to be, in a lot of ways, like a format defining card. It is just like no longer going to be as easy for you to build a deck built around scamming cards, playing a bunch of free spells, and I've got it pretty high in A tier here. I think this is an awesome design, great printing. I don't know what it's going to do to Legacy and Vintage, because I don't play as much of those formats, but for Modern, I think this is going to be a very impactful card that it may have like a Plague Engineer effect too, where it's like if people are not playing Vexing Bauble, free spells come up, and then people play Vexing Bauble, and people don't play as many free spells, and then people don't play Vexing Baubles. It might have this kind of like circular effect here, but either way, it's going to be definitely something you need to keep in mind when you're building your deck with or without free spells. In case you missed Friday's stream, I did get a preview card. Thank you to Wizards for the sweet preview for Phyrexian Tower. Phyrexian Tower is a really iconic card that sees a lot of play in Timeless, Historic, Commander, Legacy, and I no longer have to be jealous because the card is finally coming to Modern. This is a land that enters untapped, taps for a colorless. It can also tap to sacrifice a creature to make 2 black mana. Lands that enter untapped and can make 2 black mana early are all really powerful. Ugin's Labyrinth is another example of this card that's coming to Modern. These kind of fast mana effects basically don't exist in current Modern, and now we have Phyrexian Tower, Flare of Cultivation, and Ugin's Labyrinth. And speaking of Flare of Cultivation is a sorcery that wants you to sacrifice a creature to add extra mana. Phyrexian Tower is land that lets you sacrifice creatures to mana, and these cards are going to play, I think, really well together, where you're going to be able to play 4 Flares, 4 Phyrexian Towers, and like a bunch of like Arboreal Grazers in the basic land, Arboreal Grazer, Elvish something, and be able to kind of consistently make 4 mana on turn 2, which is pretty scary, pretty potent. Phyrexian Tower also helps you power out Yawgmoth. It helps you power out stuff in Hardened Scales. It lets you sacrifice your Stitcher Supplier to make mana and fill up the graveyard. You can sacrifice an Evoked Grief to Phyrexian Tower, which is, quite frankly, very crazy, especially with some other cards we're going to talk about today. It's pretty good with the Chthonian Nightmare powering this stuff out. The list goes on and on and on. Like what's really interesting to me about Phyrexian Tower is like Tower would be really good right now in current Modern, but it is going to be really good with a lot of the cards that are coming in MH3. So I think this is going to be a pretty format defining card. This is a card that I think you are going to really want to put in your Modern decks. It's a card that you are going to try to make powerful in your deck, and I've got it pretty high in A tier here. Amphibian Downpour is a pretty interesting card. It is pretty rare to see cards with the Storm mechanic in Magic anymore, and it's, I think, even more rare to see Storm cards that are permanents. Thankfully, Downpour is not that powerful of a permanent. It is a 3-mana flash enchantment where you can enchant a creature, and that creature becomes frogified. A blue frog, power and toughness 1 with losing all abilities. So I don't think this is going to be a super good removal spell. It could end up playing a bit better than you would think. Typically, what I think would happen is, like, if you're just playing this as a blue removal spell or whatever, your opponent, you'll wait for your opponent to play a spell, and then you'll cast Downpour and just like frogify 2 things, which is okay. It's okay, especially if you have like Orcish Bowmaster or Red and 6 in your deck to clean up 1/1s. There are some also like kind of interesting applications with Enchantress effects. The problem is it doesn't work with the good Enchantress effects. So I have Sithis here, which is a good Enchantress that sees play in Modern. There's also Enchantress's Presence. Both of these trigger when you cast an enchantment. Do you get to draw a card? So you do get to draw a card when you cast Amphibian Downpour. You don't get to draw a card for each of the copies of Downpour, because these are copies, you're not casting them. It would work with Enchantresses like Setestin Champion. which trigger when an enchantment enters the battlefield, so you could potentially go kind of crazy. But the problem is champion is just not as good of an enchantress effect. So maybe if we see like a enchantress to the degree of Sithis, Argonian enchantress, this kind of stuff that triggers on ETB instead of cast, downpour becomes more interesting at that point. Also, you could make a lot of blue devotion with Nykthos, and I have tried to brew some blue devotion decks in modern with Nykthos. There's some interesting stuff going on, especially with Sunken Citadel and Enigma Jewel. But two things those decks have been lacking are interaction and non-creature permanence. So this card is kind of both, but that doesn't sound like a very good deck, to be quite honest. But maybe a step in the right direction for that. So I've got it kind of here lower in D tier. Good cards for bad decks. Enchantress is not the best deck either. Just kind of an interesting card for not that good decks. One thing I'm kind of surprised they printed, but I'm really happy that they did, is a Power Crept Ceremonious Rejection. Like Ceremonious Rejection, this is 1 mana to counter a colorless spell, but it can also counter a triggered ability. And you can replicate it for 1. And I had this same thought process today on stream. I was like, wait, why would you want to replicate a counter spell? And then, oh, obviously, it's so that you can counter an Eldrazi and the cast trigger for 2 mana, which is great. They are printing a lot of Eldrazi and having a really, really potent tool that isn't like weak, like Whirlwind Denial, or really slow, like Summer Dismissal, is, I think, super appropriate. This card is also like weirdly close to main deckable. It's probably not quite, but there are a lot of good Colorless cards in the format, and there are a lot of good triggered abilities in the format too, like Urza Saga Chapter 3, ETBs of Evoking Elementals. I think that this is a card you could maybe main deck as like a one of in some metagames, which it mostly means that it's just a very good sideboard card. I don't exactly have a tier for very good sideboard cards, so I have it here in C tier. I do think this is a card that like matters a lot. It seems to be one of the best blue sideboard cards, especially with just how potent the Eldrazi are coming from MH3. Although one kind of scary thing you can do with this card is you can play it in your Eldrazi deck, in your blue-based Eldrazi deck, and if you cast Null Drifter, you can counter the Evoke on your Null Drifter and kind of scam it into play while also having a good sideboard card in the Eldrazi mirror. So maybe keep an eye out for that, but this card's really good. You'll see a good amount of it, I think. Monumental Henge is the white land in this MH3 cycle of lands that for 4 mana do something powerful and enter untapped if you control a corresponding basic land type. In this case, this taps for white and enters untapped if you control planes. You can spend 4 mana and tap it and look at the top 5 cards of your library, put a historic card from among them into your hand, and the rest at the bottom in the random order. Kind of simply put, I like this card. I think that like good, powerful card advantage mana sinks with Sunken Citadel, especially ones that don't lose you life, looking at you, Castle Locthwain, are pretty cool and interesting. I like that this card can grab you cards like Urza Saga, The One Ring, any Planeswalker, Teferi Time Raveler. And I have had this shell of like a mono white controlling mid-range shell that plays for Sunken Citadel and a bunch of Field of Ruins, but like the white castle just making a 1/1 always felt really underwhelming, and this card is a lot better than that. So I do think you could have like this like mono white Knight of the White Orchid, or the new one that destroys the land, plus all these other new sweet white cards that they're printing, kind of like this more mid-rangey shell. And then as like your card advantage, you have Sunken Citadel, Monumental Henge, and the One Ring. I think that could be kind of interesting. Probably not something I'm going to get around to trying super early, but I do think it'll be really solid and hard to interact with. So I've got it, kind of higher in the C tier here. I think all of these lands are pretty good. We'll be talking about the blue one a little bit later here too. Static Prison is a really interesting card that I'm having a hard time evaluating. Let's read it together. It is a 1-mana enchantment that enters the battlefield and you exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until this leaves the battlefield. Same text as Leyline Binding. And you get 2 energy when it enters. But at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you're going to sacrifice this unless you pay an energy. So this card could end up just not being good, but it is really, really efficient at what it does, and energy cards are also really, really good in MH3. In fact, I could see this maybe ending up like Unholy Heat, where Unholy Heat was like this common that they printed in MH2. No one had this as their preview card. It was just in like the file dump on the last day of previews. and ended up becoming, at the time, the best removal spell in Modern. And I don't think that Wizards thinks that this card is that good, but I think that the energy cards in the set are really, really powerful. The 1-mana blue cantrip lets you keep this around for a lot longer, and I think this card's kind of nice. I think one big problem with Static Prison is the card is really bad in multiples, where if you just have one in play and and a lot of your cards are giving you energy, it's okay for you to just sink energy in here, but it's if you're playing 4, it ends up becoming a bit much maybe, but that doesn't mean that the first 2 copies of this card in your deck aren't great. Hard to evaluate. Very hard to evaluate. And then one other big problem this card has is that it's pretty bad with the White Wrath, the XX white, or the X white card that gives you X energy, and then you destroy all enchantments, artifacts, creatures with mana value equal to the amount of energy you pay. This will just kill your own Static Prison. So I think that card is really good, and I think this card is pretty good too, but they play really poorly together and they're in the same color. So I think that's a big problem for Static Prison. I think this card has a good amount of potential. I have it at the moment at like the very bottom of C tier, and this could very easily go up. This could very easily go way down, but keep an eye for this one. This one is, it's a 1-mana Leyline Binding that you can actually play on turn 1. It's pretty potent. Another card that seems pretty divisive, a card we're talking about on stream today, is the Creation of Avacyn. This is a 3-mana saga, so when the turn you play it, you search your library for a card, exile it face down. Then, on Chapter 2, you turn the exiled card face up. If it's a creature card, you lose life equal to its mana value. And then for 3 mana, you just put that exiled card into play, if it's a creature, and if not, you put it into your hand. So, kind of simply put, this is 3 mana, suspend to an Archon of Cruelty, and then also lose 8 life. Or you could suspend a Atraxa and lose 7, etc., etc. You could suspend also Platinum Empyrean, and then your life total doesn't change, but you still lose the life because you lose on Chapter 2, blah, blah, blah. There's also some situations here where this card ends up being really crazy, and I think it's going to depend on how Experimental Augury plays with Creation of Avacyn, like specifically Experimental Augury, because this the only really playable instance bleed proliferator. So if you play this card on turn 3, do your Chapter 1, then you untap and you put Chapter 2's trigger on the stack. If you can respond to that Chapter 2 with Experimental Augury, proliferate your Creation of Avacyn, get it to Chapter 3, and if it works the way I think it does, which allows you to just put the face down creature into play and not lose the life, then this will be, I think, really, really potent and powerful. We talked about this on chat today. Some people said this didn't work. Some people said it did work. Some people I'm a judge. It does work. I'm a judge. It doesn't work. It was a little confusing because knowing does the game know that this face down card is a creature? I don't. It's kind of weird. It's kind of weird. So depending on how this rules interaction works, affects my evaluation of this card a lot. So we'll see. If you feel really confidently that it's one way or another, maybe leave a comment, and we as a community will find this out. But just kind of putting that aside, let's just imagine this doesn't work the way I think it does. That you're not doing any proliferate shenanigans. You're just playing a 3-mana suspend to Archon of Cruelty. I think that this card could be pretty good. You can Phyrexian Tower into this on turn 2, and then just have this card put an Archon into play on turn 4, which is really powerful. I like that this is a card that can go into a Reanimator deck that doesn't care about the graveyard, so your opponent brings in a lot of graveyard hate. You just play Creation of Avacyn. I think that's pretty cool. I think if you're slowing the game down with a bunch of Thought Seizes and other discard spells like Grief and removal spells, that you can kind of use this as a win con in your control deck, which might be pretty potent too. And the 8 life loss is tough, but you can board it out against aggro, and or board in Platinum Empyrean against aggro, and I think it'll probably be fine. I don't know. I like this card. I think it's super cool. I think it's really powerful. There's a lot of fun deck building restrictions you can, or deck building ideas you can do when you play with this card, and also Phyrexian Tower makes it a lot better. Kind of simply put. So I'm gonna go ahead and rank this in C tier for a card with a lot of potential, but not so powerful. It just is going to be where you start with a deck idea necessarily. That probably wasn't the best way to put it, but I like this card. If that proliferate stuff does work with it, my stocks on it are going to go up a little bit, and if aggro is really popular, my stocks are going to go down. The black untapped MDFC land is Boggart Trawler on the front side. 3 mana, 3/1, enters the battlefield, exile target player's graveyard. Notably, it's a goblin, and goblins are getting some love in the set, which is pretty cool. On the back side, it's a swamp that enters untapped if you pay 3 life, or tapped if you don't. All of these lands in the untapped MDFC cycle are really good. This pitches the grief. It's a goblin. It's a good utility land. We don't have to spend too much time thinking about it because like that's kind of all it is. It's not super flashy in what it does, and utility lands in general are things that you kind of select a little bit into the deck building process, and unless you're playing Oopsal spells and Belcher, it's not really that critical. Consuming Corruption is pretty cool card. It's kind of like the mono black Lightning Helix. It's black instant, deal X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life, where X is the number of swamps you control. So obviously this is a card you're going to consider for exclusively Cabal Coffers, mono black decks that only have swamps. But I think it's a pretty interesting tool. I think there's a chance that it's also better than March of Wretched Sorrow, or you end up doing something like playing 3 Consuming Corruption, 2 March, or you play a split of these cards. But one thing I have disliked about Cabal Coffers is that you do need some instant speed life gain. You're a mono black control deck. You need a way to stabilize. You need a way to offset the damage from the ring. It's like really common that you're like tapping the ring with a lethal trigger on the stack, digging for a March of Wretched Sorrow to stabilize. And Consuming Corruption, is a little bit more mana efficient at the amount of life it gains you, where it's like 2 mana gain 5, 2 mana gain 4, 2 mana gain 6, instead of like 6 mana gain 5 in like the mid to late game. So I think it's pretty cool. It's also like a bit better to cast early, where it's like 2 mana, it's Sorin's Thirst, 2 damage, gain 2, which is not great, but is better than March on turn 2, which is usually like deal 1, gain 1. So again, just kind of a nice upgrade for this deck. I'm not going to spend too much time yapping about this card, but I think it's pretty good. I like it. I think Cabal Coffers will play some copies, some amount of this card, and so I've got it kind of mid and C tier here as an upgrade for that deck. Ripples of Undeath is a really, really cool card. It's a 2 mana black enchantment. It says at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, mill 3 cards. Then you can pay 1 mana and 3 life. If you do, put a card from those milled into your hand. So this card is kind of like a weird hybrid of Sylvan Library and Chronic Flooding, where a big part of the reason why you would play this card is because you want to just mill 3 cards every turn, being able to mill over your reanimation targets, your Bloodghast, your Grave Crawlers, whatever. You're using this in part to fill the graveyard. And then also, I also really like that, you after you untap and you draw a card and you have everything laid out, this trigger happens, and then you can see, you like kind of like Sylvan Library, you get to play in your turn. Is it worth it for me to spend this mana and 3 life to get this card? Great, if yes. And if not, you can just do that whenever. Like, this is an enchantment, it's probably going to live. Like, you're going to have this steady stream of cards if you need them. One other thing I really like about this card is that these cards like Flahi Archaeologist, if there's like a Leyline of the Void or Rest in Peace in play, you can still get the card from it. The other cards are going to get exiled, but you're still going to be able to like dig for an answer to your opponent's graveyard hate. So if you're like playing a mono black random deck splashing for Pick Your Poison, this card can dig really, really fast and really deep for that Pick Your Poison, which I think is pretty cool. I don't know that this is going to be just stock in these like mono black reanimator decks, but they are giving us a lot of tools for this kind of shell, which I think is pretty cool. Very cool, very cool. Graveyard card in general doesn't have to be in reanimator. So I've got it, kind of lower in C tier card that I think is going to be a really, really nice tool for these kind of decks. Invert Polarity is a very aptly named card because it is very, very polarized in both what it does and also people's evaluations of it online. I've seen some people call this card super unfun and likely like just too good, and I've seen some people call this card completely unplayable. And usually when people are like this split on what a card does, the reality is somewhere in between. Personally, I think this card is pretty good. I think this is maybe a good way to think about it. So for 3 mana, if you win your coin flip, this is an Aether Snatch. Gain control of target spell. If you're gaining control of a Teferi, Time Raveler, Wondering, Omnath, Locus of Creation, Expressive Iteration, etc., etc., this is a really, really potent thing to do. This is like almost going to be just a game-winning play to steal your opponent's 2/3/4 drop. It's gonna, at the very least going to swing things really far in your favor. And if you lose the flip, you've cast a cancel, and you've countered their spell, and then you keep playing. Cancel is not a very good modern card, but I've cast a lot of Archmage's Charms. I've hard cast a lot of Force of Negations, and enough to know that it's just not really a losing play. And even if it's a slow counterspell, a counterspell is still a counterspell. And like obviously, we're not trying to put cancel in our deck, but if this was a 3-mana Aether Snatch, like if this was just 3-mana gain control of target spell, it would be S tier, the best card in the set, de facto. What the fuck were they thinking? De facto best card in the set. It's going to be that 50% of the time. So I think it's a pretty good card. I think it's going to be a pretty good card. I think it's like you're going to cast it. Your opponent is going to be sweating. If you win the flip, they're super behind. And if you lose the flip, their spell is still gone. So I could, at the moment, I definitely see myself wanting to try this in control decks and seeing how it plays. And I think it'll be pretty good. I think Murktide should probably give 1 or 2 copies a go and, see how it performs too. And at the moment, I've got it pretty low in B tier. Could be kind of high C tier, somewhere in this range. You don't need to get too lost in the sauce of the tier list. This is just kind of like a loose catalog of where the good cards are. Ethereum Terramander is a callback to just regular Terramander. 1 mana, 1/1 flyer. 8 mana, adapt 4, costs 1 less for each instance and sorcery in your graveyard. I'm a longtime hater of this card. I always felt like it was slow, clunky. The activated ability usually costs like 3 to 5 mana, despite chatters always saying, "Oh, 2 mana, 5/5 flyer." This card really just it isn't that. I've always felt like there was always something better to play in your deck than Terramander. So when I saw Ethereum Terramander, I thought it would maybe be similar, that this card wouldn't end up being very good, but I like Ethereum Terramander. It's a 1 mana, 1/1 black flyer that can only block creatures with flying, which is actually a pretty big downside in the Ragavan format, if I'm going to be honest. But you can, for 6 and a black, you can adapt 4 to turn this into a 2 mana, 5/5 flyer if you have 6 other artifacts. And this is just a lot easier to do in your modern deck, especially with like a lot of the other black-based affinity cards they're giving us in MH3 here. It's kind of, just a little aside, it's kind of weird how many black and red affinity cards they're printing when like Image 2 was like a bunch of blue affinity cards. I don't exactly get it, but they're interesting at least. And like one thing I really like about this is if you're playing an affinity style deck, you're just kind of okay playing these kind of, cheap artifacts as long as you're playing cheap artifacts. These are going to help enable your other affinity cards like the Ogre, like the Crab Demon we'll talk about later. And in the mid to late game, it's also going to be a really potent threat itself. So cheap artifact enabler, mid to late game potent threat. I like this card. I definitely see myself trying it in these more black-based affinity decks. And I have the expectation that it'll likely be somewhat playable. The biggest problem with these decks, though, is like how the mana just seems like it really doesn't work. So I've got it kind of higher in D tier here. Just like a solid card for a deck that's not going to be that good. Again, kind of lower power than some of these other cards we'll talk about in a bit. Aether Revolt is a pretty interesting 4 mana energy based enchantment. Says whenever you get 1 or more energy, Aether Revolt deals that much damage to any target. And as long as a permanent left the battlefield this turn, if a source would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or permanent, it deals that much damage +2. Kind of simply put, there are a lot of enchantments in Modern that let your non-combat damage deal extra damage from like 3, 4, 5 mana. None of them are playable, and this one also probably isn't. But that being said, there are a lot of good energy cards of the set, Galvanic Discharge and Amped Raptor being, I think, the best two. And the fact that this Amped Raptor has the capability to occasionally cast a 4-drop on turn 2 makes this a little bit more interesting, because if you go Galvanic Discharge or Tune with Aether into Amped Raptor, spin 4 energy, casting this on turn 2 is going to be pretty potent. And it's maybe like, it could be a good top-end energy payoff in like a more red-based energy deck. I think it could maybe end up surprising you, especially because this mode here, whenever you gain one or more energy, deals that much damage to any target, can also target creatures, and it's also that much +2. So it's maybe a little unintuitive that like when you like if you have this in play and you cast an Amtraptor and you get 2 energy, you get to deal 4 damage to any target, which is kind of interesting. But only if you have Revolt. So I don't think this card will be very good, but it is definitely on my radar. So I've got it in D tier here. Could be one that ends up impressing and rising in the ranks though. When Modern Horizons 2 came out and they printed Imperial Recruiter instead of Recruiter of the Guard, a lot of people complained, but now it's MH3 and they printed Recruiter of the Guard. I'm really happy with this reprint. I think that this card would have been maybe kind of scary post MH2. I remember Imperial Recruiter was printed and I thought, wow, this is a really iconic and powerful card. I thought that there was a chance that it would have been pretty potent in the modern format. After the last 3 years, I think the verdict is out that Imperial Recruiter is kind of underpowered. I think it has been like a nice fringe tool for some decks, and I've liked having access to it as a deck builder, and I occasionally reach for it, and it's occasionally kind of good, but never really makes a splash in the tournament scene. But Recruiter of the Guard, I think, is going to be a lot better. Mostly because it's a white card instead of a red card, where there have been several times where I'm playing like an ephemerate focused deck and I would like to have access to Imperial Recruiter, but the mana just doesn't work to splash red. And also it's always been a big problem that Imperial Recruiter can't grab Solitude. Being able to grab Solitude and use your slow 3-drop as potent 0 mana removal, I think matters a lot, especially when you're pairing it with like flicker cards like Felia and Ephemerate. And I do think Felia specifically is going to be also a big upgrade for Recruiter of the Guard. I think it's like just a good card to tutor off Recruiter of the Guard. Like if you play Aether Vial turn 1, you cast Recruiter of the Guard turn 3, you can Vial this in, untap, attack, flicker this, which is I think pretty nice. It's also kind of cool to cast this, like just have 2 mana up. Play Felia on your opponent's instep, untap, cast Recruiter of the Guard, grab a Solitude your opponent's blocker, attack with Felia, and then grab whatever the best thing is in the situation. It's also kind of cool with Delny, Streetwise Lookout, which is a card I do like. One, Recruiter tutors Delny, and also Delny doubles the Recruiter trigger, so it's like this is like maybe a nice like top end card advantage package for white ephemerate based decks. And I think this is mostly going to be, again, just kind of like a nice tool you can reach for. You're building a flicker deck, you're playing Felia, you're playing Aether Vial. Do we play the Recruiter of the Guard package or do we do something else today? And I think this is like just the perfect appropriate power level, very iconic card that people like. I think they did a great job with this reprint and I am excited to have it legal and modern. Oh, it also sacks to Flare of Fortitude pretty well, which is definitely relevant. Oh, it also sacks to Flare of Fortitude pretty well, which is definitely relevant. I do like a good Lizard Wizard in my Magic the Gathering. Party Thrasher I think is a pretty good one. It's a 2 mana 1/4, so not boltable, which is really relevant, that gives non-creature spells you cast from exile convoke. Very weird line of text. But if you're wondering how am I going to cast cards from exile, at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you can discard a card. If you do, you exile the top 2 cards of your library, you can choose one of them and play that card this turn. So I think this card may play kind of well with like Gleeful Demolition type effects or Gleeful Demolition and Kadotha Rebirth, which it's a spell that you can convoke with Party Thrasher, and then you can make 3/1/1s and use them to convoke also. Convoking out the One Ring seems pretty nice too if you can flip it up. And of course, Expressive Iteration is one of the better card draw spells in Modern and plays really, really well with Party Thrasher. I like this card. I don't think this is a card that you are just going to build your deck around, but if you just kind of happen to be playing a Gleeful Demolition deck that is playing like Light the Stage, Rin's Resolve, these kind of cards, Lizard Wizard is a really cool tool for the deck. So not great, kind of bottom C tier, but if it gets there, it's really, really going to get there. And I do like that 4th point of toughness. If it had 3 toughness, it would be D tier, 4th point of toughness, C tier. Abstruse Appropriation is a kind of an interesting power crept other end, where for 4 mana they both exile target non-land permanent, but Abstruse Appropriation lets you cast that card for as long as the game goes on with mana of any color to cast that spell, which is a pretty powerful and interesting potent 2-for-1. It's kind of interesting that the void on this card actually matters a lot because you can't pitch it to Solitude or Grief, but it also can't be Veil of Summered, so kind of combination upside downside. Probably more of a downside not being able to pitch your 4-drop to any Evoke Incarnation. But I do think this card is likely going to end up being a little too slow. Like Vindicate was an MH2 card that people thought was going to be like appropriate power level for the format, and that might have been true pre-MH2, but the card just really barely saw any play the whole time. And I maybe Obtruse Appropriation could see Fringe 1-2 of maybe sideboard, maybe main deck. I don't know, not gonna be that good. Kind of like Vindicate, and of course Utter End is like never close to playable, but these cards are so similar I wanted to compare them. So got it kind of low in D tier here. Again, could be a sideboard card, could be occasionally something you main deck if you're just there already and the metagame is right, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. It is pretty good against the One Ring, so I'll give it some credit there. Birthing Ritual is one of the hardest cards to evaluate, I think, in Modern Horizons 3. It is a 2-mana, only 2-mana enchantment that says at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature, you get to look at the top 7 cards of your library, then sacrifice a creature. If you do, put a creature card with mana value X or less onto the battlefield, where X is 1 plus the sacrifice creature's mana value. Rest go on the bottom. So I would definitely rank this card a little bit lower if it wasn't for a lot of the other tools that we have available to us in MH3. Flare of Cultivation, Phyrexian Tower are 2 cards that want you to be playing a bunch of cheap green creatures and sacrificing them to make a bunch of mana. Birthing Ritual is kind of an interesting way to turn those cards into more value, and it comes stapled to a relatively hard to interact with 2-mana enchantment. It's also pretty cool that this lets you look at the top 7 and then decide, do you want to sacrifice a creature or not? It's kind of like, imagine that in your Collected Company deck, you could just look at the top 6 cards of your library and then say, oh, I'm actually not going to cast it. that would definitely make Collected Company a lot better. It's also 7 instead of 6, which is kind of interesting. I don't think that this card is that likely to see a lot of play in Yawgmoth, although you could build your deck to where it could facilitate this card. But that's because sacrificing a 3 into a 4 is kind of tough. There are not that many good 3s that are good to sacrifice. But sacrificing 1s into 2s and 2s into 3s does sound pretty good. And again, what I really like about Birthing Ritual is that because we have Flare of Cultivation, because we have Phyrexian Tower, you're already kind of set up to play like a Young Wolf and Striggergeist and a Boreal Grazer in this like cheap like value deck, and Birthing Ritual just feels like it could fit in this kind of shell really, really well. So I think this card is kind of blooming with potential, and it could really exceed expectations, and it could also flop really hard. But at the moment, I've got it kind of low in B tier. Surprisingly, one of the most hyped cards from MH3 just in the community is Nadu Winged Wisdom. It's got pretty good stats, 3-mana, 3/4 flyer, and it has a very odd ability. Creatures you control have this ability. Whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, you put it into your hand. And this ability triggers only twice each turn, but it's twice per creature because the creatures themselves have this ability. When I first read this card, for some reason, I thought the land entered tapped. Kind of like, maybe I was thinking of a Risen Reef, but the land enters untapped, which is pretty dang interesting. At the moment, it seems like the best 2 ways to like target your own creatures are maybe going to be random, obscure, Kamigawa, uncommon, Shuko, and also Bristly Bill. Bristly Bill is kind of especially nice, where you'll landfall, put a counter on a creature, and then that trigger can sometimes put a land into play from Nadu, which will trigger landfall again, which will trigger Nadu again, which can maybe trigger Bristly Bill again, etc., giving you a lot of value. Shuko, however, is a 1-mana equipment that has equip 0. So for each creature you have, you could equip 0 twice and trigger Nadu twice, generating a lot of card advantage. When talking about Nadu on stream, I feel like I've uncovered that I have a bias against 3-mana creatures and towards 2-mana creatures when we're evaluating them. Like if there's a 2-mana creature, I feel like I'm a lot more likely to give it a lot of slack and be more willing to build a deck around it. 3-mana creatures, kind of not so much. And I think this has been a formula that's been true for a long time. Like, you're just not that incentivized to build around 3-mana creatures. But I think with Freeze Strider Lookout, especially recently, I don't think you have to have this hard and firm, like, bias against them, especially because Nadu's got 4 toughness, which is great. If your opponent just removal spells it, you get a card off of it, which is a nice potent 2-for-1. It's a card advantage engine that doesn't trigger Shielded or Bowmasters, which is really nice, and you could potentially combo off with it. You could potentially draw like 4 or 5 or 4 or 6 cards a turn with it. This card's got a lot of potential. So when we were talking about this card on stream Friday, I was a lot lower on it. At the moment, I think I like this card a lot. I would love to like try to play it with Flare of Denial. I would love to maybe try to play it with Flare of Cultivation and try to get it a little bit bigger. I like it a lot with Bristly Bill. I think this card is just doing a lot, and it's doing a lot well. The biggest problem with Nadu probably is that Nadu is like a high quality card that pairs with lower quality cards, if that makes sense. Like we have to play Shuko, and I like Bristly Bill, but Bristly Bill isn't one of the best modern cards, and so I've got it like a little bit lower because of that. I've got kind of mid and B tier here. Also, every single card in B tier I think is very good. Just because a card is in B tier doesn't mean it's not a glowing review. Every card here is phenomenal. Every card in A tier I think is just maybe a step above. But I think Nadu's very good. And it could end up being much stronger than this too. Could end up flopping a little bit because of the kind of quality you have to play with it. But definitely a very interesting card, one way or another. So Ghostfire Slice is a card I saw getting a lot of buzz online. This is also one I misread at first, but it is a 3-minute instant, Devoid. This spell costs 2 less if an opponent controls a multicolored permanent. Deals 4 damage to any target. So one thing is, like, if you're playing a colorless deck, or if you're playing a deck that can make colorless mana, and you want to hate on multicolored permanents, Null Elemental Blast is probably going to be the better option for you. So this is going to be more of like a deck for red sideboard cards against multicolored permanents. And quite simply put, there are not that many multicolored permanents in Modern. I guess Nadu is a new one, so maybe that's something to evaluate here. So this does kind of answer Nadu, but they still got a card out of the deal. But beyond that, this can deal with like a Red and 6 kind of cleanly, could deal with a Grist kind of cleanly, could deal with a Territorial Kavu, sometimes on turn 2, and sometimes it has 5 toughness turn 2. It just doesn't answer that many things that effectively. And in general, there are not that many multicolored permanents in Modern. There are definitely some, but you could like pretty easily go a whole league without playing against a single multicolored permanent. And so, kind of simply put, this card is not main deckable because there are not enough multicolored permanents in the format to main deck it at the time of making this comment. And I think there are just better sideboard options. So I am kind of ranking this here in E tier, very fringe sideboard card, borderline unplayable, but this could change one day, and it's kind of nice to have like effective hate pieces if all of a sudden there is like a really, really weird format with tons of multicolored 4 toughness cards. Buried Alive is another sweet reprint into Modern. It's a very iconic card. I remember trying to play with it in Legacy when Arc Like Phoenix first came out, Dark Ritualing into it. Unfortunately, Dark Ritual isn't legal in Modern, and so despite the fact that you could try to do something cool like Pyretic Rituals and Manamorphoses, I don't really think Buried Aliving into Phoenix is really going to be the optimal way to build that deck, unfortunately. You could do some cool stuff with it besides that, like getting 2 prized amalgams and an Archamoeba, but you're probably not going to want to do that in Dredge, and if you're playing Buried Alive and prized amalgam and Archamoebas and more fair strategies, you're kind of diluting the quality of cards in your deck a little bit. Like, I'm not super happy to draw prized amalgams and Archamoebas, but they like at least pitch to Subtlety, and prized amalgam pitches to Grief. Could also maybe like in a more like casual kitchen table style deck, you could like Buried Alive for 3 Bloodghast with like a Goblin Bombardment into play, and you could go kind of crazy with Goblin Bombardment Bloodghast, but it seems kind of slow and really weak to Graveyard Hate, just like all the bombardment decks I've ever played, I guess. But I don't know, it's a really cool deck building tool. I would love for this card to be good. At the moment, I think it's going to be a little slow, a little underwhelming, a little bit vulnerable to Graveyard Hate, but it's also like the kind of card that if they just print a couple more good graveyard cards, it could definitely get there. So high D tier for me at the moment. Don't think it'll be super duper impactful, but we'll definitely try to build around it, and maybe hopefully it goes up a little bit. Crabomination, maybe the best named card in Modern Horizons 3, is a 6 mana 5/5 Crab Demon. It itself is not an artifact, but it can emerge from an artifact, so to reduce this 5 black casting cost by equal to the mana value of the casting cost, so maybe like Frogmite. And when Crabomination enters the battlefield, your opponent exiles the top card of their library, a card at random from their graveyard, and a card at random from the hand. And you can cast one of these exile cards at random without paying its mana cost. So it's like half a Hand of Turok, and then also you're gonna get to cast something. You're gonna get to cast something. It's very, very weird, and kind of like I mentioned earlier with the Pteramander, there's just a lot of like black-based affinity cards, which are pretty interesting. And what I like about Crabomination is it lets you attack from a slightly different axis than the rest of the affinity deck usually does. You're not just putting creatures into play and turning them sideways. You are interacting with your opponent's hand, and you're interacting by just casting some of their stuff. And the fact that you could cast this turn 2, probably more realistically turn 3, I think makes it pretty powerful. I think it's very unlikely that you play 4 Crabominations, but that's okay. Just because the card's like 1 to 3 of in a deck doesn't mean that it's not a good card. And I'm very interested to try to build the more black red focused affinity decks. Got it kind of high C tier, mostly based on power level, but I am kind of worried that the decks you played in are still going to be not that good, but Crabomination is good. I think would be a big part of these decks actually being strong, if that makes sense. Ashling Flame Dancer is kind of like this weird hybrid between Omnath Locus of Creation and Birgi God of Storytelling. Ashling is a 4-mana 4/4 that says you don't lose unspent red mana as steps and phases end, which is not really that good of an ability in Modern, very good in Commander. And it has this other ability, Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, you discard a card, then draw a card. You have to do this non-mana ability, notably. If this is the second time this ability has resolved, Ashling deals 2 damage to each opponent and each creature, and if it's the third time, you make 4 red mana. So it's kind of funny. It's like the inverse of Omnath, where it makes the mana last instead of second. I guess not the inverse, but it's just kind of like a weird redux. Like the boxes look the same, like 4 mana, 4/4, small text ability, landfall, magecraft, 3 different abilities as they resolve. Notably, Ashling still lets you rummage, discard a card, draw a card every single time you cast an instant or sorcery, unlike Omnath, which stops doing things after you play lands. I don't know. I think it's really cool when they kind of like call back to other cards like this and kind of fuse them together. I think Ashling is a super cool card, very well designed. I think she's also unplayable in Modern because Omnath is like the bar for 4-mana creatures in this format, and Omnath is just so much better than an Ashling. And like I've tried to play Here Axonil in Modern a little bit, which is also like 4-mana 4/4 that like if you untap with it you win the game. I think that's kind of the same thing with Ashling, 4-mana 4/4 untap win the game. Same thing with Here Axonil to some extent, but that card just also like turns into a land when it dies and turns back into Here. This just dies. This just gets Fatal Push. This just gets Unholy Heated. Unfortunately, in F tier, despite being so cool, so it's such a sweet card, unfortunately, just not going to be playable. Fanatic of Ronus is the best 2-mana mana dork ever printed, and that includes Devoted Druid, although that's not necessarily that high of a bar to clear. It is a 2-mana 1/4, so unboltable, not bolting this bird. Tap, add a green, ferocious. If you control a creature with power 4 or greater, this makes 4 mana. A 2-mana creature that can tap for 4 mana is wild to me. And if it dies, you can eternalize it for 4 mana, and then it becomes a 4/4, and so it can just tap for 4 mana by itself. And so having like this built-in resilience, beef on the 4/4, the ability to tap for 4 mana, is really wild to me. I could see this slotting into like the green Eldrazi deck with like Delighted Halfling in this card, and then you play like a Thought-Knot Seer, and then you tap for 4, and you play like a 1 ring, and that could be really potent. When I was talking about this card on stream, there was a lot of people like, it seems underwhelming. And I just feel like this is really indicative of like how high the standard for 2-mana creatures in Modern is. Like this is 2-mana 1/4, so like unboltable, can make 4 mana. 4 is so much. 4 is really so much. Like there's almost nothing that can make 4 mana by tapping in Magic, let alone a 2-mana creature. And the fact it also eternalizes. This card is pretty crazy. It's also kind of interesting that you could sack this to the green Flare of Cultivation, and then eternalize it the next turn. So if you go turn 2 Fanatic, Flare, untap, eternalize. Probably not going to do that often, but I like this card a lot. I think it's very powerful. powerful. I think it's one of the best two-drop green creatures in Modern, and I have it here kind of towards the bottom of B tier. Necrodominance is a pretty cool take on Necropotence, the very classic, iconic 3-mana black enchantment. Same casting cost. This one is legendary for some reason. If you know why Necrodominance is legendary and Necropotence isn't, maybe comment below because I have no idea. You skip your draw step, just like Necropotence. And at the beginning of your end step, you can pay any amount of life if you do draw that many cards. I really like the design on this trigger here, where one, if your opponent responds to this trigger with Orcish Bowmaster, you know how many cards you can afford to pay, potentially, how much life you can afford to pay, which probably won't be that much, but at least you're not going to go, okay, I'm going to pay 10. Okay, I'm going to cast Bowmaster, just kill you. And then it's also really nice that this trigger resolves all at once for digital play, where in Magic Online and Arena, it's really annoying to like just put those cards into your hand once at a time. The triggers take a long time to stack. I like that this is one trigger, very well formatted. It has a pretty big downside of your maximum hand size being 5. This part is kind of hard to evaluate, but I think it mostly doesn't matter that much. I think you're probably going to play Necrodominance and then like fill up to like 7 cards, discard 2, and I think that that'll be fine. It also exiles any card or token that's put into your graveyard from anywhere. I really like that it exiles the Wicked Roll token. It helps make that card a little less annoying. And I see a lot of people commenting about pairing Necrodominance in a Grief Scam deck, but it is kind of weird that this card doesn't let any of your scam stuff work after it's in play. But it does sound really good to like evoke Grief, sack your Grief to Phyrexian Tower, and then play Necrodominance and draw a lot of cards, and then you can just discard your scam cards if Necrodominance is in play. That might be fine. I think it could also be a pretty interesting like way to just like slam in an Esper combo deck and then pay a lot of life and then try to next turn Angel's Grace, Spoils the Vault, Thassa's Oracle combo. Just like dig for these 3 specific cards and then you just discard your other cards because you just need these 3 to win. I think that that could be an interesting build in that deck. And kind of simply put, this card is pretty powerful. There's not a ton of like super potent raw card advantage cards in Modern. The best one is the One Ring, but the ring like is pretty slow in the amount of cards it draws. It draws 1, then it draws 2, then it draws 3. It builds up. This like immediately can give you access to a lot of cards in a super unique way. And like if you like, there's nothing like more efficient at digging than this, I think, in the Modern format. And so, because it's so unique, because it's so powerful, and also because they're printing a ton of good black cards with Phyrexian Tower and all these like graveyard stuff, I'm into it. I'm into Necrodominance. I don't think this is going to be a Cabal Coffers card. I don't really think this is going to be a scam card because of this downside here, but I think that this will likely be an important engine in a Phyrexian Tower deck of some kind. And I'm excited to try to figure it out. I hope that you come with me for that journey to try to figure it out. But at the moment, I've got it pretty solidly in B tier. Not the most exciting, but Eldrazi Linebreaker is a pretty good Eldrazi. It's a 3-mana 3/3. Devoid Trample at the beginning of combat on your turn. Target creature you control gains haste and gets +X/+O, where X is the number of Eldrazi you control. So by itself, 4/3 Trampler for 3, but really realistically, you're hoping this costs 2 because you're tapping an Ugin's Labyrinth or an Eldrazi Temple to cast it. The problem I have with this card is at the moment it seems like the Eldrazi decks are going to want to be base green, and they could be mono green, or they could splash blue for like Null Drifter and some of these sideboard cards. But it doesn't really seem like there's anything really drawing them to red besides Eldrazi Linebreaker. The Urbrask card I think is really bad, and unless we see like 1 or 2 more really good red Eldrazi, I don't think this is going to be the way to build the deck. But it is a way to build the deck. It is a way to build the deck, and there is the 3/1 Eldrazi that can steal a creature, I guess, and that pairs really well with this card. So maybe this could exist. You could do this, but my issue also is like you're not going to be as good to imprinting to Ugin's Labyrinth in this more aggressive build of Eldrazi with a lower curve, and if you're not as good at imprinting to Ugin's Labyrinth, what's the point? Why are we playing Eldrazi? So I have it high in C tier. This card is good, but it just feels off for how I'm expecting to play these Eldrazi decks. But it could end up just really impressing, or there could be a bunch of good red Eldrazi, and I'll just eat all these words, I guess. The blue Archway of Innovation, enters untapped if you control an island, taps for blue, and for a blue mana and tapping the Archway, you can give the next spell you play improvise. Improvise is kind of like convoke, but you tap artifacts instead of creatures, and you can't pay for colored costs. So this is potentially a really interesting way to try to cheat out big colorless spells like the One Ring, Karn, Emrakul the Promised End, maybe a combination of these cards in combination with like a lot of cheap artifacts. Um, Archway of Innovation is kind of like the green land of this cycle where you're really, really trying to build around this card. If you have this card in your deck, I think you're trying to use this as like a fixed Tolarian Academy, and you're going to try to turn your like blood tokens and your clue tokens into really powerful mana engine and cast some big stuff, which I think is pretty cool. I think it's pretty fun. I don't think it'll be super good because I think this kind of plan will likely be a little bit slower than you would hope, and I think this kind of plan will likely be pretty vulnerable to all the efficient artifact hate that exists in the format. It kind of simply put two, it just doesn't seem that it's going to be very rare that on turn 2 you're going to have 4 artifacts in play to on turn 2 improvise out a One Ring. It'll happen sometimes, but that's really when you would need it to happen for this to be really potent, I think, to be able to like turn 2 ring consistently. The fact that this is more likely to let you cast the ring on turn 3 is just not as exciting. Maybe powering out Emrakul the Promised End would be really exciting. I think Emrakul the Promised End would be the best thing to power out because it's like the cheapest Eldrazi. The new Emrakul, notably, it has a madness cost of 6 Colorless specifically, so you can't pay for that Colorless madness cost with the convoke, so you can't really convoke that Emrakul out very well. Emrakul the Promised End, maybe you can. But I think this will be more like a fringe kind of like off meta way to build like kind of a broken mana deck. But this card is potentially really powerful. It is also potentially a card that is going to get better as time goes on. Maybe they print more enablers for it, but right now I've kind of got it just in C tier, just a C tier. Kozilek's command is what the hell is this card? It is X colorless. Like all the other commands, choose 2 when you cast it. You can make X spawn tokens, the 0/1s that sack to make a colorless mana. Target player scries X, then draw a card. So nice, card selection, cantrip here. Exile target creature with mana value X or less, and then exile X cards from any graveyard. Now, I wouldn't really think this card was that crazy, except for the fact that it is a Kindred Eldrazi spell, which means that Eldrazi Temple can cast this card, which means that on turn 2, if you have 2 Eldrazi Temples, if you have Eldrazi Temple Ugin's Labyrinth, on turn 2, you can go exile your creature, make 2 0/1s, or you can go make 2 0/1s, scry 2, draw a card. You can, and the fact that like this card is also just so versatile at instant speed. It is mana ramp, it is token creation, it is card selection, it is a cantrip, it is creature removal, it is graveyard hate, all on one card. It just does everything, and it is, I think, really, really potent. And another way to put this too is the Eldrazi deck is going to be good post MH3. It has a ton of tools. It is very likely that there will be a good Eldrazi deck post MH3. And because this card is so versatile and so powerful, I can't imagine not playing 4 copies in my Eldrazi Ugin's Labyrinth deck. At the moment, I just think this card is easy slam dunk 4 of. And I just have it kind of like solidly in A tier. Solidly in A tier. Like if you're just on the play and you have a double land and your opponent plays a creature on turn 1 and then you exile it and draw a card, or you exile it and make a spawn, you're just ahead. You're just really ahead, and this is going to be a super common line. It's good early game, it's good late game. It is good. Iskmir Iron Eater is another one of these black-red affinity cards from MH3 that have kind of surprised me. This is, I think, the best one, or one of the most relevant ones. And again, this is one of these cards, like kind of classic Modern Horizons card. Very powerful. You have to build a new deck around it, though, to really utilize it. 8 mana, affinity for artifacts, so cost 1 less for each artifact you control. 5/5, enters the battlefield, draw X and lose X life, where X is half the number of artifacts you control rounded down. So if you have 6 artifacts and you're casting it just for 2, you're going to draw 3, lose 3, 8 artifacts, draw 4, lose 4 for 2 mana. If you control 4 artifacts, it is 4 mana, draw 2, lose 2, which is okay, but like a little bit slow, maybe not so slow if you're powering out with Springleaf Drum. And this ability too, 4 mana, sacrifice an artifact, deals damage equal to the sacrificed artifact's mana value to any target. This ability may look kind of slow and dopey, but in combination with all of the Mirror Enforcer, Sojourner's Companion, the new Frogbite Mirror Enforcer, this is, 4 mana, deal 7 damage to your opponent's face, which is going to be lethal a huge chunk of the time. And because you just drew a bunch of cards off your Imskir, whatever, however you say this, you're pretty likely to find one of your 7 mana affinity card off of the card draw, which is pretty cool, pretty potent. This is like your payoff for playing this kind of shell, but it is really weird that in MH2 we had a bunch of blue affinity cards like Thought Monitor, and in MH1 we had Urza, and in MH3 we're like, okay, affinity cards are black red now, and I don't really get it. I think it could be cool to try to play this card in like an Academy Manufacturer deck or in an Oni Cult Anvil deck too. Like, it doesn't have to just be affinity because this card is really powerful, but this ability here does really want you to pair it with the Mirror Enforcer, Sojourner's Companion stuff. So I don't know. This is kind of just a card that it's really powerful, like Crab Abomination, really powerful, but in kind of a bad deck. And ranking this on the tier list is kind of tough because, this is kind of like a good card for average deck. I don't know. It's the tier list again. It's kind of an abstract concept. These are my thoughts on the card. Really, I feel like my thoughts on the card are always maybe more valuable than just where it is on the tier list. But of course, the tier list is way more digestible. So here it is. I like the card. Primal Prayers is a really interesting fixed errated version of Lurin. 4 mana enchantment, enters the battlefield to get 2 energy, and you can cast creature spells with mana value 3 or less by paying 1 energy rather than paying their casting cost. Notably, you don't pay energy equal to their casting cost. You just pay 1 energy instead of the casting cost for any 3 mana creature. And if you could also do it at instant speed too, which is a pretty nice upside. Also, unlike Lurin, this is not a symmetrical effect. If this is in play, only you get to play these spells for free. And so there's a lot you could do with this card. You can like maybe combo off with Recruiter of the Guard. You can use Guide of Souls as a way to just kind of ignore the downside on Primal Prayers. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, gain 1 life, gain 1 energy. So this is like maybe a combination infinite life payoff and infinite energy payoff for Primal Prayers. It's 2 to roll off Recruiter of the Guard. You can put Satoro in play, and every time you cast something else off of Primal Prayers, and also when you cast this off Primal Prayers, you get to draw a card, which is really nice. You can ramp into Primal Prayers off Phyrexian Tower and the green flare, which I think is really interesting. Greenbelt Rampager is a card a lot of people are talking about with Primal Prayers. I kind of don't think it's that important of a piece, but it is kind of interesting where when it enters the battlefield, you have to pay 2 energy if you have 2 energy. But if you don't, you bounce it to your hand and you get 1 energy. So this is a way for, if you only have 2 energy, for you to just kind of like get infinite ETB triggers. So like that's like infinite draw with Satoro, which is kind of interesting. Infinite life with Guide of Souls. So it could be cool, but I just don't think this card is like mandatory for the Primal Prayers deck. That being said, I think the combination of the Green Flare, Satoro, Recruiter of the Guard, Guide of Souls, Phyrexian Tower, and Amped Raptor, I think that all of these cards together are going to make a good Primal Prayers deck. Amped Raptor also sometimes will just be able to cast Primal Prayers turn 2 if you go turn with Aether into Raptor, which is kind of nice. It also like gives you like some extra energy, which is nice. I think you probably want to play that card in your Primal Prayers deck. But yeah, I think this card is good. I think there will be a Primal Prayers deck. One thing I really like about this card is that it doesn't work well with Yawgmoth, because Yawgmoth is a deck that's all about putting a creature with mana value 4 into play. This is only 3 or less. So like you can have a creature-based combo deck that isn't Yawgmoth in Modern, maybe, which is, I think, pretty nice. It's also kind of cool that this can be disenchanted in response to the ETB trigger. If you don't have any energy already, you just don't get any value out of it, which is maybe a nice like safety valve on the card. And I think this card will be pretty good in Modern. I've got it pretty high in B tier. Again, every card in B tier I think is phenomenal, and I'm really excited to build a Primal Prayers deck. Thank you so much for watching till the end of the video. I hope that this has made the very overwhelming MH3 spoiler season a little bit more digestible for you. It's pretty overwhelming for me as someone who builds decks in Modern full time, so I can only imagine what it's like for someone who doesn't build decks in Modern full time. If you're interested in seeing the full current updated list, I'm going to be posting it over on my Twitter account, and with a link for you to also just make your own if you want to work on this yourself. This is a living document. We're going to be changing a little bit after the full spoilers come out tomorrow, after we see some new cards, after we talk about them. And we're also going to start building some decks live on stream starting this week. So if you're interested to see what that process looks like, it's going to be a little different from what I usually do, but tune in and we'll have a good time. So again, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate y'all. I'll see you next time. I think one more PowerPoint and then we'll be done.